Good evening. On behalf of Carnegie India, the Institut Montaigne, and the Fundação Oriente, it gives me great pleasure in welcoming you to this very special conversation on India and the EU, fostering multilateralism in a multipolar world. We're joined today by Gunnar Wiegand, the Managing Director for Asia and the Pacific at the European External Action Service, and Sandeep Chakravorty, Joint Secretary for Europe West at the Ministry of External Affairs in the Government of India. Thank you so very much, gentlemen, for joining me today. For the last 2 days, representatives from the private sector, from government, and domain experts from the EU and India have been engaged in a series of discussions on finding ways to cooperate further and being honest about divergences between these two geographies. In all these discussions, we kept coming back to the point about multilateralism. With this in mind, my first question has to do with a reform multilateral system. If I could ask the both of you, what does a reform multilateral system actually mean to you? And a follow-on, where exactly do you see the convergences or divergences between the EU and India when it comes to restructuring multilateral institutions such as the WHO, the WTO, or the UN? So perhaps I could start with Mr. Wiegand first.
Well, let me start with a quotation of two eminent Indian, I think, participants. Definitely the Foreign Minister of India, Jaishankar, he participated in a very prominent way at the beginning of this event. And he said Europe is the natural partner for India's reform and transformation as a model, but also to work together can help shape global outcomes. And the nature of the emerging technosphere is the main topic of our time. So he defined that given our interest in each other as being based as democracies and rule of law societies, but also our outward look in making the multilateral system work properly and in making sure that this multilateral system answers the new challenges which are linked to the digitalization of our economies is a very strong basis for working together as EU and India on the multilateral system. I would like to add perhaps a more values-based quote by ORF Chairman Samir Saran, who said that if Europe remains rooted in its fundamental principles as being democratic, open, liberal, plural, supporting a transparent and open market economy, defending rule of law, the rights of individuals, and freedom of speech, the world will have a chance of being liberal. Well, of course, whatever we do is not just because of technological or economic interests. It is also because we want to defend the values which characterize our societies and which are also the fundamental values of the basic individual civic and political rights. And these are equally key for us when defending multilateral institutions. And the Human Rights Council is a very good example for that. So to summarize, I think that both the economic and technological challenges we have, the need to have effective answers to global challenges, whether it is climate change or whether it is world pandemics, the need to defend freedoms and individual rights makes that both Europeans and Indians have every interest to work together in rendering several of our multilateral organizations more effective and in reforming them.
Okay, thank you, sir. Come back to the point about, in more hard, real terms, what India and the EU could possibly do. But before that, if I could turn to Mr. Chakraborty for your thoughts, sir.
Thank you, Rudra, and good afternoon to my friend Gunnar. Wonderful to see you on this panel once again. I think we are making it a habit to meet each other virtually. I would, like Gunnar quoted my minister, External Affairs Minister, and his inaugural remarks today of the same conference. I would like to quote the Portuguese foreign minister who joined my minister. And I distinctly remember when somebody asked him, why India and Europe should cooperate. And he said very succinctly that India and Europe constitute the largest democratic spaces that the world has. 1.3 billion Indians and 400 million Europeans. So 1.7 billion people living in democratic space. This is the largest democratic space in the world, and there is so much in common. And Gunnar mentioned many of that. Now, you asked me, if I'm correct, what is the meaning of reformed multilateralism as India is concerned? You see, I think Minister Dr. Jaishankar mentioned it, that particularly in this pandemic times, we found, or the UN system was marked by its absence. It did not come up with the recognition of the pandemic. The WHO was mired in controversies, and there was no UN-wide response to the pandemic, and each country was left on its own to do whatever it could. And I distinctly remember that one of the first, maybe plurilateral initiatives that was taken was by India when it reached out to its SAARC neighbors, and then activated the G20 mechanism, and Prime Minister Modi spoke to the Saudi leadership, and the G20 meeting was held. So, but there was no UN-wide, arrangement or mechanism to deal with the pandemic. And even today, when you are seeing the vaccine response, it is a group of countries or individual countries which are working together. So I believe that we in India and the EU have faith in multilateralism. We believe that multilateralism can deliver common goods for a large majority of the world's population, and we have seen it in action. And I think the problems of multilateralism are not solved by a retreat from multilateralism, but by reformed and effective multilateralism. I think that is our view, and I think that's why some of these initiatives which some European member states have taken, such as Alliance for Multilateralism, and very recently one more initiative by Spain and Sweden in the UN. This is finding currency, because I think the people of Europe and India believe in multilateralism, and we believe that it is important to strengthen these structures. Where we find a problem with, or we need reform, is, for instance, the UN system reflects the realities of the Cold War or the post-Cold War, and it doesn't reflect the modern 21st century reality. So we need reforms there. But UN Security Council is only a part of it. I think there is need of reform in the WTO. There we find some divergences with the European Union, because we feel that sometimes the European Union is not taking cognizance of the developmental needs of countries such as India. And India may be a big economy, but our per capita incomes are low, and our requirements and need to protect our marginal farmers and others is high. So sometimes we find that there is lack of understanding, and similarly we believe that other multilateral institutions, perhaps the WHO, need to be reformed so that it can take care of things that we are grappling with at the moment, which is the pandemic. So we believe that there is a lot of commonality in the viewpoints of the European Union and India. There are divergences, but that comes from our history. It comes from the state of development of India and Europe. You have to understand that across European Union there may be diversity in per capita incomes and economic diversity, but maybe every European country or EU country is at a higher developmental level per capita income wise than India. So that understanding is what we seek, and I think there is so much of strategic coincidence. There is so much of coincidence of values. I think we need to work together to see that we are able to cooperate as far as economics and trade is concerned.
Let me move to one other area of multilateralism where we've talked up trade, we've talked up cooperation for quite some time, which is the Indo-Pacific. Increasingly, number of European countries have been committing themselves to a particular vision of the Indo-Pacific. If I take the examples of Germany and Netherlands. The EU, however, doesn't have one vision as far as we know, of the Indo-Pacific in itself. So my first question to Mr. Wiegand is, how do you conceive of security in the Indo-Pacific? And in the near future, what are the practical ways in which you see India and the EU actually working together?
Well, let me first say that I concur with Sandeep said that we need to work on rendering the World Health Organization more effective, that the lessons need to be learned. How could such a pandemic so fast globally affect every single family in this world? And that includes, of course, the socioeconomic impact. And we need to take seriously this panel on the independent and impartial review, how to make this organization effective, strengthen its response. Equally, on the reform of the WTO, we need to work. We have promised each other that we would work more on this at the last EU-India summit. That includes, for particular dispute settlement, but also how to deal with the heavy subsidization of companies. And let me just recall also that apart from the UN as an organization, we have important agreements which are found with the help of the UN, but are self-standing, such as climate change and Paris agreements. And this is certainly something where also we need to work closely together, and we are need to up the ambition. And we are very pleased to see the announcements of the Chinese president recently, but also in particular the Prime Minister of Japan and the President of Korea, who have the same vision expressed as the European Union, which is climate neutrality, which is greenhouse gases to be neutral by 2050. In all of these areas, we want to work closely with India. On Indo-Pacific, we have a term here which has lately somehow replaced the term Asia-Pacific in the minds of some. Traditionally, Asia-Pacific is used in particular in Europe because Asia starts for us next door to the Middle East, which is our neighboring region. And that means Afghanistan and India and Pakistan. And for Europeans, Asia starts there. We had never any doubt because we are linked for many centuries directly with you. We share the same continent with India. While when you come from the Pacific, from far away shores, that is less evident. You have to define that the Pacific includes also the Indo-Pacific area. So I think from that historic perspective, it is understandable that some nations have developed this concept to be inclusive, while for us, Asia has always been inclusive of course, the Indian subcontinent. Now, having said this, we of course see that several partners have developed such strategies, that India has also its version of it, and that we have now several member states having such strategies. And we are seriously considering, but this is still at a brainstorm stage between all member states, whether we should develop some kind of value-added strategic outlook to this region on issues which we would typically not include when approaching individual partners in that very vast and very dynamic region. And of course, Europe has major interests, whether they are security interests, whether it's the security and safety of critical supply chains, whether it is ocean governance. And there are also a number of regional organizations with whom we are intensifying our cooperation, both regarding the Indian Ocean as well as the Pacific Ocean. So the point could be made to develop such a strategic outlook, but the decision has not been made. We are still in the reflection stage whether this is necessary and would provide value added. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Chakravorty, so how does the space evolve from an Indian thinking when it comes to cooperation with the European Union, given that there are only a select number of European Union member states that are actively involved in the Indo-Pacific? And as Mr. Wiegand said, it's perhaps sometime still before the EU takes a wide and inclusive vision on the Indo-Pacific. So, sorry, I think you're on mute.
what I wanted to say is that, whether you call it Asia Pacific or Indo Pacific, it is important to understand that both for Europe and for India, our most of our trade is in these waters, and our economic relationships are in these areas. For instance, 50% of India's trade is with moves east of India, and a large percentage of the world's shipping is in these waters. And our view of the Indo-Pacific has evolved over a considerable period of time. I'll give you an example of what Indo-Pacific is not. For instance, we have this APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation. Now, it is an exclusive architecture. It excludes certain countries. Whereas our concept of Indo-Pacific is an inclusive architecture. It doesn't exclude anybody. It has certain principles, and we believe in ASEAN centrality. And when you are operating in this area, whether it is as a net security provider, or you are trading, or you are an investor, our expectation is that we will follow certain principles. One of them is, of course, transparency, and others. There are many principles. In fact, I think Prime Minister Modi's speech at the East Asia Summit in Bangkok clearly spells out our vision for the Indo-Pacific, and also the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, which has come out very, very beautifully with the 7 pillars of cooperation, where we can really contribute to the common good in this region. So I think countries which subscribe to that are willy-nilly involved in our vision of the Indo-Pacific. For instance, you mentioned France, which has come out with a strategy. Germany has called its Indo-Pacific ideas as a guideline because of the way the German thinking goes. I don't have to get into German history. As of yesterday, I think the Indo-Pacific Commission in UK has come out with its report. It calls it the British tilt at the Indo-Pacific. Even in the virtual summit we had with Italy, if you see the joint statement, there is reference to the Indo-Pacific, and it mentions that the Indo-Pacific is the connection between Europe and Asia, and projects and whatever infrastructure development that you do in this area should be guided by principles of transparency and international norms. So I think many people and many countries are realizing the value of this proposition that we call the Indo-Pacific and are subscribing to it. Whether they have a guideline or a strategy, it depends on the country, and maybe many countries will not have. But also maybe, as Gunnar would know better, maybe you will have a debate on having. But some of our interlocutors in European capitals have said that they would like to move the European Union to have an Indo-Pacific strategy, which is welcome news for us. And we find a lot of coincidence, if not in the strategies, but at least when we talk to our partners in European Union in what we think as our Indo-Pacific strategy and what they think could be or is their strategy for this part of the world.
Okay, thank you. I'm mindful of the time. We have 5 minutes left, but I think any discussion today would be a miss unless I brought in the question of the US elections. So my first question on that to Mr. Wiegand is, there's clearly a new verve in global politics that will have effects in the way in which different parts of the globe deal with multilateralism, internationalism. And it's very clear that the Biden administration seems to have an almost missile-like approach to recover globalization. So with that in mind, I was wondering, in the near future, where do you see any change in the way in which the EU and India were to deal with themselves? Are there particular hotspots internationally that open up for more convergence? I'm thinking of Iran, for instance, where it's very clear that the Biden administration will look to recreate some version of the JCPOA, or any others. Mr. Wiegand first, sir.
Well, this question inscribes itself into the wider question whether we will have a multipolar world with multilateral rules or without multilateral rules. That there are different poles which will have to find the right balance between them, I think is largely understood and accepted. The question is whether there are rivaling geopolitical spheres which operate with unilateral means to enhance their influence, or whether they are applying the same rules. And where Europe stands on this question is very clear. By definition, we stand for the same rules for everyone. And we are therefore pleased if there is an administration coming, which has very clearly throughout the electoral campaign and its platform said that it does care about multilateral rules, that it does wish to rejoin the Paris Agreement on climate change, that it does wish to rejoin the JCPOA on Iran, that it intends to go back to the World Health Organization, considers that you do need a world organization taking care of global challenges of this type, because this is, of course, in the DNA of Europeans. This is because also we are a multilateral organization, perhaps even more than just in the history of our nation states. But therefore, I cannot give you a precise answer because we are seeing an administration in the making, but there is no Biden administration yet. But the indications from the platform, the indications with the first nominations, including that of former Secretary Kerry as for climate, or of Mr. Blinken, who is of course well known in Europe and many other parts of the world, it indicates that the United States wishes to look more out for functioning multilateral institutions and rules, but also for working with allies and listen to allies. And of course, since we are the closest allies and for the longest time of the United States, this is something which is rather reassuring to European ears, which does in no way take away the necessity for Europe to make sure that it pursues its own policies and has what it is calling the open strategic autonomy further developed. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Wiegand. And Mr. Chakravorty, if I can turn to you, it's a bit of an odd question, but do you see the sort of the new architecture or a reformed architecture with the new administration? Do you see that as a positive when it comes to, say, India's approach to the EU? Do you see greater areas of convergence? Sorry, again, I think you've gone on mute again. Sorry, it's a possibly a technical issue.
You see, our relationship with the US is very bipartisan. So we have had fantastic relations with the Clinton administration, then with the two Obama administrations, and similarly with Republican administrations, and presently with the Trump administration. So we do not have much concerns as far as our bilateral relationship is concerned. But as Gunnar said, there will be a transformation in the transatlantic relationship possibly, and also on climate. As if the US comes back with new energy into the Paris process and some other areas in which it had retreated. I think it will be a force for multilateralism will reemerge, and I think that is good because as you itself and India, we believe in reform multilateralism. We believe in these institutions, and I think it will be a increased role of the US, EU, and India is a force for good in world politics and geopolitics. And I think as the US comes forward and it engages more with the world, it will engage more with Asia, and obviously it will engage more with India. And I think the portents are very good and positive. And I think if the transatlantic relationship becomes better, and but even then, I think what we will of course see, and which some of our interlocutors have been mentioning, is that the march of EU for greater strategic autonomy may continue, irrespective of how the transatlantic relationship mends or amends. That will happen. So I think that could be a force for good in the world, and we are happy with working more with the EU, and the EU also believes in multipolarity, and there are several poles in the world, including India, EU, and Europe, and the US.
No, thank you very much, and I look forward to asking this question again maybe next year when we're able to do the EU-India dialogue physically in some nice capital, either in India or in the EU and then take stock of globalization as we see it. But Mr. Wiegand, Mr. Chakravorty, thank you so very much for joining us for a short but very effective and enlightening conversation. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.